I spent the last week at AWS reInvent in Las Vegas. Want to know what I thought? Let's talk about it. So welcome to the Cloud Computing Insider. My name is Dave. Let's get going. So I spent a week in Vegas this week at AWS reInvent, which means my sleep schedule is wrecked. Obviously up all hours, going to different dinners and different events, things like that. I'm not a big conference fan, and reInvent is kind of no difference. I like going to conferences, but typically the ones that I'm speaking at, and never been invited to speak at reInvent for the reasons I think we'll see during this video. But ultimately, it's kind of the Woodstock of cloud computing. And so if you're going to go to one event per year, those are the ones that are going to be sponsored by vendors, in this case, AWS. That's the one to go to. 60,000 people were there, and it seemed like it. I mean, lines everywhere to get into the sessions, to get into the keynotes. Out on the expo floor is not shoulder to shoulder, and obviously it's a huge expo floor, in the Venetian in Vegas. And so did my time there and came out with some thoughts, and I figured I'd share them with you here. So what do I think? Well, honestly, it's a mixed bag. Some of it is genuinely brilliant. I think AWS is an impressive company sometimes, and they kind of blow me away with some of the things they're able to do, certainly in the past. And I think it's going to change in how we build and run systems. Some of it, however, is basically optimistically marketed. In other words, they're pushing a lot of the hype that's out there right now. And a few things made me wonder if we're inventing new ways to complicate magnificent architectures. I couldn't help but think, as I was, sitting through the presentations after presentations, most of them having to do with agentic AI and AI agents, about the fact we could be overcomplicating this stuff a bit, and that may be working against us. And so that thought came to me many times during the week, and I'll tell you why. So my core take is that AWS is struggling to find its footing in a new market. I think they were a bit late to the AI party, even though they've had AI that's been part of their stack since the beginning, and all the clouds have. And suddenly with the generative AI stuff and the boom that occurred in 2022, all eyes are on them in terms of looking for innovations in that direction. And many of the critics out there, including many of the investors and people who are using the technology, made it clear to Amazon Web Services that they could have been doing better. And I think the pressure has been on them for the last 3 or 4 years to start moving in a direction that's going to be more innovative. But I still think they're struggling. So they found themselves behind the AI 8-ball and have moved, to the AI side of things. In many instances, forgetting their existing customers. This is a point I'm going to make during the video, who may not have AI on the radar screen now. And I talked to many organizations out there where they were impressed and they liked to see the AI announcements, but AI wasn't going to be on the radar screen for another 2 or 3 years. And their concern is that they're getting left behind. So if they're leveraging the traditional services that Amazon Web Services is offering, then they're still looking to get the innovation. They're still looking to get the technology refresh. And it's clear that they're focused is on the AI side of things at AWS. Obviously, I don't work there. I don't know how the budgets are allocated, things like that. But definitely from the architecture that we're seeing out in the marketplace, that's certainly reality. So 70% of their announcements were directly related to AI. So I entered all their announcements into ChatGPT and asked them which ones were AI and non-AI related. And 70% of them, had AI-focused announcements they were making. Where if you look at their market and kind of break out, which side of the AWS cloud infrastructure that most of the enterprises are using right now, it's probably 70% traditional and 30%, AI. Obviously, I don't have the exact numbers, but that's kind of a good guesstimate based on, my observations and what I've seen and some of the analysis that's come out of the place. So in other words, they're focused on an area of the market which they view as expanding, and the majority of their existing customers are basically how they make their money right now, are not necessarily moving to AI, aren't planning to moving AI anytime in the near future. And it's a bit of a weird situation right now. So in other words, they're investing in the AI side of their, cloud infrastructure, but many of their existing customers, who are the ones that are going to basically buy into their AI trends as well, aren't necessarily going to move to AI in the near future, meaning 1 year, 2 years down the line. Eventually, they're going to use it. And obviously, they see it as strategic technology, but it may be a bit early for them to steer this ship, so heavily toward AI when many of their existing customers, people who are leveraging their technology and now don't see that as the path in near term. So the concern that many of their traditional attendees that I talked to was that they feel that AWS is leaving them behind for AI and they're not getting the innovation love that they feel they should be getting. Many of them complained to me that the number of service refreshes and a number of service fixes that go out, they believe has slowed down. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. I haven't looked into that in detail, but they feel that way. And I think it's the fact that, there's so much focus on the AI stuff that are traditional, cloud computing stuff, storage, databases, things that are running enterprises these days have largely been left behind, certainly in terms of focus. So many talked about moving away from AWS because of this. And so I heard a lot of people talking about moving to more of the smaller players, moving to the sovereign cloud providers, private cloud instances, things like that. Because if they're not getting the value from AWS that they feel they should be getting, then, with the focus on AI and agentic AI, things like that, we're going to talk about that next, that if they're getting the short end of the stick and they may be moving to cheaper, less name brand platforms. And I think many organizations are looking at that right now. So I'm going to break the announcements or the trends that I saw at AWS reInvent this week into 3 buckets because, pretending, it was all either genius or garbage, I think would be dishonest. So first, the good, what AWS generally is doing right, and they are doing some things right. And so these are announcements that solve real problems, move the ball forward for enterprises, and won't require a PhD in cloud psychology to adopt. And then second, the bad, the parts that really are starting to concern me. Overreach, architectural gotchas, confusing product overlaps, and signals that AWS might be optimizing, more marketing slides than I think customer realities that are out there. And finally, the ugly. And these are downright disturbing trends. Places where lock-in is getting, stickier, complexity is exploding, or the AI story feels more like a casino bet than engineering decision. And we'll talk about that. So keep in mind that I'm not a tech news channel. So all you're going to get here is my opinions and a few of the announcements, but not all of the announcements. And if you're looking for news from the event, you can find many other places out there, journalists out there that have covered the event and can give you a better listing of many of the details that occurred this week at reInvent. So I urge you to check those out if you need that detail. So first, let's talk about the good. I saw a number of releases and announcements there around infrastructure that they're improving upon. So in other words, existing services that are very popular now that they're basically upgrading and moving into different, more innovative directions. Probably not as innovative as much as they're just improving them. So if you look at some of those, we can look at some of the processor releases. Graviton 5, it's basically makes ARM the rational default for EC2 with 25% better performance and efficiency, translating directly into lower cloud bills. That's something that's going to be good. And I think that ultimately these sorts of things will be of value to many of the customers that are leveraging them. Also, the Trainium stuff creates a real competitive pressure on GPU economics, making large-scale training and inference, financially accessible beyond a handful of tech giants. I love announcements like that because that's basically improving things in place. And obviously higher throughput with these things. And, in Amazon's role is actually creating and in managing some of these chipsets that they run in their cloud. That kind of puts them into the supplier role as well as the consumer role and the seller of the services role, which is a good place for them to be. In other words, they control the supply chain, what the processors are doing, and how they're putting these things into action. Also, some of the serverless customizations that were out there, I thought that was a great announcements. They make the serious LLM tuning, something that they call boring. In other words, in a good way. And it's able to take serverless fine tuning, which removes one of the biggest barriers to serious LLM adoption. And with this release, no longer you need ML ops heavy lifting or cluster wrangling just to adapt to a model. into your domain. So that's a step in the right direction. In other words, the ability to apply serverless in areas, serverless, which is something that AWS does very well, but also other cloud providers provide that capability as well, to get it into production to make running these things easier. And finally, Amazon S3 vectors and 50 terabyte object size increase, which sounds very geeky, but that is something that's going to be very exciting to people who run those systems. And Amazon S3 vectors is now GA, which can store up to 2 billion vectors per index, 20 trillion per bucket. And obviously with the use of AI and the use of RAG, that's going to be an important infrastructure to have on hand. And then probably the most interesting one would be AWS Interconnect, which is their multi-cloud networking with Google, which basically surprised a lot of people. So they introduced AWS Interconnect. It's a multi-cloud, starting with Google Cloud to provide managed high bandwidth private connectivity between clouds using a new joint interoperability specification. So what's interesting there is the fact that multi-cloud was always a bad word at AWS, and I think they would admit that. In other words, if you talked about multi-cloud, they didn't want to put that in terms of their messaging, and they would say that it's easier for them to adopt a homogeneous AWS solution because all the interconnections are going to be tested, than move into a multi-cloud deployment. So they viewed that as a kind of a bad word. In fact, I was encouraged when I was speaking at some of the AWS events not to use multi-cloud in the messaging. And obviously I was Mr. Multi-Cloud for the last 10 years. And I think that worked not in their favor, because in many cases, I think they pushed themselves out of many deals when obviously many of these organizations are looking to leverage best of breed technology, and obviously the bits and pieces from AWS and bits and pieces from Microsoft and bits and pieces from Google. And if they pushed back on that as a, promoted architecture, then they were leaving themselves out of a lot of these deals out there. And now adopting multi-cloud, I think is a step in the right direction. They should have done it 5 years ago. And I think they're going to see some uptick in the fact that they're providing, generally available cross-cloud services where they're supporting the architectures that many of their existing customers are already using, which is going to be a multi-cloud. So step in the right direction, 5 years too late. So the bad, and it was easy to see. The big trend here is just really too much of a focus on the agentic stuff. I get it as an architecture. I'm all in with the agentic, based AI agents, agentic AI frameworks. I have one of the best-selling courses out there on agentic AI architecture, and I'm continue to innovate in the space. And obviously, I want to see people succeed with the use of AI agents and agentic AI, but there's just too much focus on it now. In terms of the number of problem domains and use cases out there, they're going to be, leveraging agentic AI, to some sort of a benefit to the enterprise. And so I'm just seeing crazy amount of hype and spending in there. And by the way, it's not only AWS, but it's Google and Microsoft and, everybody out there who's in the tech space. They've declared their loyalty to agentic-based deployments, and now they're reinventing or agent washing their existing systems, for agentic AI. And I think that clearly AWS felt they were behind the 8 ball and they were behind the curve in terms of some of the agentic AI capabilities that they wanted to bring into the market. And they figured they got some criticism in terms of their ability to move into a generative AI infrastructure, and now they're focused on agentic AI. So they're doing things like announcing frontier agents, security agents and DevOps agents, and everything's an agent, I guess that's the best way to put it. And so they unveiled 3 frontier agents, new class of autonomous AI agents that can operate for hours or days without human intervention as extensions of software teams. And no, I built agentic systems before. I'm able to do that without using foundational agents. So I'm not quite sure what the differentiation is there, but they evidently think there's going to be one. Amazon Bedrock AgentCore. AgentCore is not anything new. Production-ready agent platform. And AgentCore added policy preview for natural language guardrails on agent actions. Might be a concern there. What were you using before? In other words, you should never release an AI agent without heavy governance around them. I guess they're doing governance within the code sets. And so I always assumed that AgentCore had some governance that was associated with it. Evidently not, because they're releasing, kind of the first editions of that now, or basically able to make it more formalized. It's probably a better way to put it. I'm sure they had some sort of a governance systems in there, but it was a bit more custom than some of the policy stuff that's in there. Evaluations of continuous behavior monitoring, 13 dimensions, richer, memory, episodic learning, all that kind of stuff, agents. And then the next would be AWS AI factories for on-prem and sovereign AI infrastructures. And it's able to deliver a dedicated AI infrastructure, including NVIDIA GPUs, training chips, networking AI services like Bedrock and SageMaker, deployed directly into a customer's own data center. So this would be, doing this stuff on-prem, which would be interesting. And I think what's happening now is that AWS is feeling the pressure that they're going to have to be a bit more flexible in how they run on different customer environments. In many cases, customers are going to want to run stuff in their own data centers, private cloud instances of AWS, things like that. And Outpost would be an example of that. That's another story unto itself. And they're going to have to be better at, figuring out how to use these existing infrastructure things. So that was kind of a trend there. But the agentic mass movement, to me, when I, kind of got back and thought about what I just saw, seems like an afterthought. It seems to be reactionary, and that kind of leaves it to be, something that's bad. So I feel a desperation there. I feel that they're moving very quickly into a space that is certainly going to have value. And I think AWS is a bunch of smart people, and they're able to make this successful unto itself. But I think that the amount of time and energy that they're spending on it now relative to the other things that they should be focused on, including the traditional side of their cloud, is going to lead them down to the wrong path. I don't think they're going to see the demand uptick from all the agentic stuff that they're pushing out into the market now. I think some of the AI infrastructure is going to be valuable, and some of the chips they're going to push out in the marketplace are going to be valuable. But pushing a deployment architecture out there, it's something that's going to be used each and every time, which is kind of how it's being sold, is not realistic. I think that agentic AI, as I mentioned many times before on the show, is going to have a purpose. It's going to have use cases, but as I talk about in my courses and talk about in my writing, that it's very narrowly focused in terms of ability to bring value. You got to remember, if you're deploying agentic-based systems, that's typically going to be as much as 5 to 10 times the amount of cost in building a similar system, which is non-agentic based. Even traditional, I'm saying traditional now, generative AI systems and machine learning systems, or even systems that don't use AI. You got to remember, everything out there doesn't need to have AI as a feature of it. And the concern is that it's going to be overused. And the concern is that people are going to move toward it very much like some of the other things of the past, service-oriented architecture and microservices and cloud-native development, which are perfectly fine. They're perfectly applicable architectures, but only in certain problem domains. And agentic is no different. And my concern is that if AWS and Microsoft and Google, and they're all doing it, by the way, not just picking on AWS here, is pushing everything out as agentic, use agents, that it's leading many of these enterprises that follow them, many times follow them blindly. You got to remember, 60,000 people, showed up, to reInvent this year. And those are all, AWS fanboys and girls. And they're going to move in any direction that AWS is moving, but they're going to end up moving to less than optimized and under optimized architectures are going to cost them many times the amount of money than they should. And I think, very much like some of the mistakes we made in cloud computing, which is driving a lot of the repatriation these days, we're going to see the same mistakes as people are moving to these deployment models when they certainly should be considered, but they're not going to be the end state each and every time. And they're being sold as that right now. And that was never mentioned, at least I saw it wasn't mentioned in the sessions that I went to. And it would have been nice if we put some architectural realities around what utilizing agents means. And the fact of the matter is, the reality of it, that in the majority of cases, the use of agentic AI is going to be contraindicated. It shouldn't be used. It's too expensive. And I would have liked to heard that discussion. I didn't hear that this week. So what about the ugly? Well, some of the announcements were a little concerning to me. AWS Transform agentic modernization of legacy systems. I heard this a bunch where they're talking about technical debt and they're talking about the legacy systems that are out there and the fact no one likes these systems and we're trying to upgrade them and modernize them as quickly as possible. So they're offering a service called AWS Transform, which is agentic modernization of legacy applications. So the ability to kind of take an application and turn it into a swarm of agents, I'm assuming, or some sort of a way to modernize this existing system. In many cases, that may make sense, but in most cases, it won't. And my concern would be the cases where it won't, wherein we have to be very careful with our legacy systems. We have a tendency to undervalue them, almost use them as a punchline in jokes. And the reality is they're very important systems that run many very important applications within enterprises out there, more than you think. And I think that just taking these plug and play modernization approaches where we're trying to create up, agent factories and things like that here and all these buzzwords again, we're just going to end up making mistakes because we're trying to move these things at scale and we're going to end up making bad decisions at scale. And we're going to have to undo these bad decisions at some particular time. So in many cases, people are promoting them as something that's going to be able to reduce some of the technical debt that's out there. And they're actually going to be creating more technical debt. And we saw this within cloud computing. Many people moved applications using lift and shift, application migration factories and moving them into the cloud, and then ended up with very inefficient applications that were running in the cloud that were, basically sucking twice as much money, out of these organizations as they thought they were going to be. They figured that they were going to be, cost optimized, and we're going to get a better deal out of the cloud because we're using shared infrastructure, things like that. In many cases, not all, that turned out not to be the case. And I think we're going to see the same thing here. So when I see factories and modernization, let's get to it quickly, things like that, migrate first and we'll ask questions later. That's something that's concerning to me because I see the majority of the time people making huge mistakes that they have to fix later, or somebody like myself has to come along and fix later. And you don't have to do that. You can just look at the architecture now, look at the requirements, and figure out how to use the technology effectively. So, and last but not least, in terms of the ugly, is something I considered positive early. In other words, something was good, and that was multi-cloud. The concern to me was when this came out. In other words, I get it, and AWS is moving toward multi-cloud, and I think their clients are telling them that multi-cloud is going to be very important to them. They have to be able to use other people's clouds within the context of using their systems. And the concern now would be way too late. It's 2025. Multi-cloud was a thing 10 years ago. I was writing and speaking about it. I was architecting systems to leverage multi-cloud architectures. And in many cases, people who were all in on the AWS or all in on Microsoft or all in on Google were pushing back on that. And all I was really doing was promoting an architecture that was leveraging best of breed technologies to optimize the architecture to bring the most value back to the business. So my concern is that it was even an issue. In other words, you should have looked at this as an architectural opportunity for your clients years and years ago. And it's a bit disconcerting to me that we're bringing it up now that, suddenly we were offering these various multi-cloud things. I think it's a bit of a swarmy thing. I think it's, a bit pretentious. And I think it's a mistake. And so we got to start looking at these problems with architectural realities. We don't seem to be doing that. We seem to be looking at these problems through the lens of whatever technology providers that we think we're going to use, in this case, AWS. I'm not picking on AWS here. They're all kind of doing the same thing. But we need to start first with our architecture, start first with our business, and back the appropriate technology stack into the architecture, into the business problems we're looking to solve. And we're not doing that yet. And my concern is everybody is moving into AI, and obviously for good reasons. AI is, awesome technologies, leverages a true force multiplier for businesses out there. They're going to end up making the same mistakes. And we're going to see billions, perhaps trillions of dollars just go down the drain in terms of under-optimized systems we're paying too much for to get the same amount of value from. And as businesses, we can't do that and be sustainable longer term. So that's kind of my thoughts around reInvent this week. And by the way, AWS could not have been a nicer host that hosted me, paid for everything, by the way, just so we're clear about that. And I went to lots of parties, both AWS sponsored parties and parties that were sponsored by some of the other vendors that were there. I saw lots of friends, people I've been, haven't seen for a while, and, things like that. I thought it was a great event. If you like those kinds of events, that's the one to go to. They obviously, put no holds barred on the experience and making the experience good for you, including experience for guys like myself, influencers, analysts, whatever you want to call us. And so will I go next year? Well, we'll see if I get an invite back after this video. But I suspect that I'm going to take the opportunity to learn as much as I can. Obviously, keep an eye on AWS because they're a huge part of the market. The majority of the public cloud provider services that are leveraged out there is through AWS. And I'll keep an eye on the big three and see how it goes. And I'll report it here to you guys. Well, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also, check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn Learning courses, and of course, my Generative AI Architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks that this is another one of my videos that you should watch now.